Good evening. Venerable Chodron is teaching in LA tonight and on her way to the Sakya conference in the Blue Mountains of Australia. So for the next 3 Fridays, we'll resume our review of the topics that she's already taught in Approaching the Buddhist Path. And tonight we're looking at 2 sections, Emotions and Survival, and Working with Afflictions. So for those of you with books, that starts on page 52. But we'll begin as usual by setting our motivation. We can begin by reflecting how Buddha Shakyamuni was a teacher of reality, that all of the 84,000 teachings he gave was to overcome some misconception about reality, some distortion, to correct or counter some distorted way of thinking. And he summarized those misconceptions into 4 wrong views, holding what in reality is impermanent as permanent, holding what in reality is impure to be pure, holding what in reality is in the nature of suffering to be true happiness, and holding what in reality is selfless to have a self. These misconceptions keep us focused primarily on the activities of this one brief lifetime alone, and they create an obstacle for developing the thought that seeks to benefit our infinite future lives and all sentient beings. And so of the 4 misconceptions, initially, perceiving what is impermanent as permanent is the most harmful. And this is because this view completely prevents us from reflecting on impermanence and death. And it blocks us from making effort to develop the thought that seeks to benefit our future lifetimes. So I thought we'd start with a little experiment as part of our motivation. If I asked you to describe yourself to a group of people, Venerable talks a lot about identities. So just take a moment to notice what identities, what characteristics you would share with a group of new people who were asking you who you are. And so very quickly, probably, it's likely that we thought of our gender. I'm a man, I'm a woman. Maybe here at the Abbey, we might include our monastic status. I'm a nun, I'm a monk, I'm a bhikshuni, bhikshu, shiksamana. Or lay friends might think of their marital status. I'm single, married, divorced. It's complicated. Or whether you're a father, a mother. Maybe you thought of your profession. I'm a teacher, a nurse, a physical therapist. Or maybe your religion, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, etc. Or maybe you thought of other defining characteristics. But I wonder if any of us thought to mention that we're a constantly changing stream of mental consciousness passing through a series of experiences that we call lives. Isn't that our most fundamental nature? So broadening our understanding of ourselves as something that goes beyond this one life alone inspires us to engage in guarding ethical conduct and to create good rebirths and to work towards full awakening, not just for ourselves, but for all beings. So again, tonight as we look at the mind, the nature of the mind and afflictions, let's engage in this review to accomplish these far-reaching spiritual goals of a good rebirth, liberation, and full awakening for the benefit of all beings. Did any of you think to include this aspect of yourself, being a constantly changing stream of mental consciousness, subtle mental consciousness, passing through a series of experiences we call lives? And yet, if we really think about it, that's what's enduring through all our lifetimes, isn't it? So it's interesting to think about, and as we look tonight at the nature of the mind, and also looking at how afflictions affect that mind, then we can keep this at the forefront of our awareness. I really enjoyed preparing for tonight, just reading through this text. Every word is just so rich. We're so cared for by His Holiness and by Venerable Chodron and her efforts to put these books together for the last 20-25 years. I really felt that when I was reading through the book. And Venerable Kunga made a similar comment today. During the Memorial Day retreat, I was standing at the sink washing dishes with an older student, and this person said to me, "You know, I've heard these teachings before, and I know the nuns here have heard these teachings before, and yet you all sit there with such rapt attention. What is the key? What's the trick? How do you do that?" And so a couple things came to my mind immediately, and I would be interested to know what comes to your mind. So the things that came to my mind is that one is humility, that until I have a realization of these topics, I need to go through them again and again. And that's, I need to remind myself of that. So tonight we'll be going through material that all of us are, I think, relatively familiar with, unless there's someone new to the topic. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I know for myself I need to constantly review these things, otherwise it's easy to forget in moment-to-moment daily life. The other thing that came to my mind was one key I have found is meditating on how to properly rely on the spiritual mentor. You know, if you think about some of the benefits of proper reliance, whether it's in thought or action, especially in thought, that every moment that we're listening to teachings from our teacher or reviewing them or reflecting on them, meditating on them, familiarizing them in whatever way, we are moving closer to full awakening. That's something that we can count on, right? That's the nature of karma. And that's the kindness of the teacher, that our teachers keep repeating these topics again and again so that we can actualize them and so that we can actualize the full potential of our mind. So those are two things that came to my mind immediately. And I'm curious how you might have answered that student.
I think for me, after kind of having a basis, kind of like a tapestry of information about the path, each time I hear a teaching, it goes in and becomes part of that tapestry in a more, I don't know what the word is, like it builds that tapestry more. Some more strings go in to make it more rich, more deep, more complete. Because all of these teachings you could study for such a long time, you can always peel off another layer of the onion. So each time I hear it, that's kind of what's going on. And because I haven't gotten to the end, then it's always interesting, I think.
I really appreciate hearing the teachings over and over because I have had my own experience. Like Venerable Jigme was saying, when I first came here, I was coming to the Share in the Dharma days, and the teachings were on the book, How to Don't Believe Everything You Think. And it was just being started. So I have a real affinity with the first sets of verses in that because my mind was very clouded and they didn't make a lot of sense to me. I didn't even know what some of them were referring to exactly. And And the more I read them, the more I like them. And also, I read Insight into Emptiness maybe the first winter after I had come here, only about 7 months, 8 months after I'd come here. And it was confusing to me. Some of it I was just like, well, I'll put it on the back burner. I'll read through it, and then I'll read it again sometime. And the very next winter, I read it during a Manjushri retreat. And the thing that kept coming up for me was, I read this before, really? And so, yeah, I think Jeffrey Hopkins said something about thousands of times we need to hear this stuff. So I really appreciate that and believe that.
I think as time goes on and I hear the teachings over and over again, I really begin to understand the power of, familiarity. Because for a long, long time, when my mind got confused, I didn't have many antidotes. I didn't have something in my back pocket to use to help counteract whatever afflictive states of mind. But as years have gone on, maybe I surprised myself, is that I'm actually calling up without much effort certain topics that I have an affinity for, and that I'm able to use them to inspire my mind, to counteract some sort of rising of some, unsettledness in my mind, which I never was able to do even, 5 years ago or 6 years ago. So I really see that just hearing them over and over again, I'm owning them in a personal way and using them as part of my way to take care of my own mind. And so that's really a nice thing to see, that I'm actually starting to more easily, the familiarity is becoming really steadfast on certain topics.
I think when I first met the Dharma, my first teacher said that there are some people who hear the teachings on the Four Truths and then they're like, yeah, I've heard this before. What else? Give me something new. And just warning us against having that kind of mind, right? Because that is the core of the teachings and they're so hard to realize. But the moment you think, I've heard it before, you dismiss it. I think every time I go to especially a live teaching, I always feel like I'm learning something about my own mind, really, that's being pointed out through that interactive experience with hearing a Dharma teaching. And often it's like Venerable said, it can be very disconcerting. It pushes your buttons because right there you get to see the dirt and you know what you need to work on. Like the Dharma is not talking about some alien experience. It's like, hey, here are your afflictions. Great. What am I going to do about them now?
Yeah. And what you said reminded me of something else, and that is that if we don't review teachings after we hear them, our mind can become calloused towards them. So that's also, that could be a contributing factor to this other student, I don't know, or any of us for that matter. And we hear so many teachings here that it's a challenge to review them all. It really takes a lot of mindfulness and diligence, doesn't it?
It's also good to look into when I listen. Can I explain it in the same way, or kind of testing myself? And another thing is, since so many lifetimes I have afflictions in my mind and negative karma, so listening to the teachings is very precious compared to that, and it's the only chance to, or as a starting point to get out of the circle.
I read, I think, from Geshe Sopa, I think it was him or it might have been Geshe Nawang Darge, and I find this to be true. They said that actually all the profound topics are at the beginning. So like just what you talked about tonight in the motivation, those are very profound topics. I mean, to realize impermanence, which we hear about from the start, is a very profound thing. It can take you really far. So, no problem listening again.
So the first section that we're going to look at is called Emotion and Survival. It's on page 52 for those who have a hard copy. It's wonderful how His Holiness links these things to modern science, for those of us who have a scientific bent. Previously in the book, we learned that at present there's no widely used Tibetan word that directly translates as emotion. However, the Tibetan language contains words for the various emotions spoken of in the Western language, like love and anger and compassion, jealousy and greed. And I remember in the teachings, Venerable encouraged us to imagine what it would be like to grow up in a culture that wasn't focused on my emotions. I know, did you focus a lot on your emotions growing up? Or last week? I certainly did. A lot in my 20s and 30s and 40s, and if I'm honest, my 50s and 60s, yeah. Emotion I found in the Oxford Dictionary, meaning a strong feeling deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationship with others. Instinctive or intuitive feeling as distinguished from reasoning or knowledge. Isn't that interesting? And the origin is from the French, emotion, or émouvir, I don't know, you'll have to correct me, means to excite, and it's based on the Latin, which means which denotes a social moving, a stirring, an agitation. So that's interesting too. Merriam-Webster says it this way: emotion is a conscious mental reaction, such as anger or fear, subjectively experienced as strong feeling, usually directed towards a specific object and typically accompanied by physiological and behavioral changes in the body. So Miriam is staying current with neuroscience and updating her entries. Okay, the word feeling is also vague and problematic because it's already used in Buddhist translations to indicate the aggregate of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral experiences. So it doesn't include this more general usage as emotion. So let's look at page 52. His Holiness starts by saying, science tells us that there is a biological basis for our emotions, both afflicted emotions and beneficial ones. We have instincts to draw closer to whatever supports staying alive and to drive away whatever harms us. The need for food, shelter, and companionship motivates us to seek and procure these requirements for human life. According to this theory, certain emotions are conducive to our survival and arise due to biological factors. For example, jealousy and arrogance both encourage competition, which leads to better performance and a greater likelihood of our genes being passed down to offspring. I think we could debate that, don't you? It's a theory. It's a scientific theory, okay? Anger and fear can be used to avoid or destroy what threatens our life and well-being. Scientists say from an evolutionary perspective, those emotions would not be present in us if they didn't serve a useful purpose. What do you think about that? That's a scientific point of view. It's a speculation, and from what we know from a Buddhist point of view, these emotions have just been with the mind stream since beginningless time, so create the conducive conditions and they're going to pop up, whether it helps us evolutionarily or not. So are scientists actually proving that these things are products of evolution, or that or they're just matching a situation with what looks convenient? When we're angry, blood goes to our arm muscles in case we need to fight, but when fear comes, the blood goes to our legs so we can flee. Okay, that's interesting. Coincidence or cause and effect? On a purely biological level, emotions such as attachment, anger, and fear may assist animal and human beings to stay alive, and from that perspective, they may be considered beneficial. So, it's worth thinking about. Is fight or flight an evolutionary thing, or is it something we brought with us from previous existences and just happens to fit into the situation? I think it's interesting. I found an article. I did some just looking on the internet to learn a little bit more about this, and I'm sure there are as many theories out there as there are scientists studying this. But I found one article, a 2015 article by Joseph Ledoux, a professor of neuroscience at New York University, called "Rethinking the Emotional Brain," and I think it's very telling. He says, emotion is a major research growth area in neuroscience and psychology today. A search of PubMed citations for the 1960s yields just over 100 papers with the word emotion in the title. In the last decade, emotion titles grew exponentially, more than 2,000 scientific articles. He says, emotion has happened. But What exactly is it that has happened? What is being studied in all these papers on emotion? Actually, the term emotion is not well defined in most publications. Perhaps this is not surprising, since there is little consensus on what emotion is and how it differs from other aspects of the mind and behavior, in spite of discussions and debates that date back to the earliest days of modern biology, Darwin, 1872, and William James, 1884. He says progress in understanding emotional phenomena in the brains of laboratory animals has in fact helped elucidate emotional functions in the human brain, no doubt about it, including pathological aspects of emotion. But what does this really mean? If we don't have an agreed upon definition of emotion that allows us to say what emotion is, and how emotion differs from other psychological states, how can we study emotion in animals and humans? And how can we make comparisons between species? So I appreciated his honesty. And he said, the short answer is that we fake it. This is a scientific article in, I forget what magazine, but it was a medical journal. Introspections from personal subjective experiences tell us that some mental states have a certain feeling associated with them and others do not. Those states that humans associate with feelings are often called emotions. So he's linking the two, isn't he? Feelings and emotions. Those states that humans associate with feelings are often called emotions. The term emotion and feeling are in fact often used interchangeably. In English, we have words like fear, anger, love, sadness, jealousy, and so on for these feeling states. And when scientists study emotions in humans, they typically use these feeling words as guideposts to explore the terrain of emotions. So it's a little problematic between this conversation between Buddhists and scientists, or even between scientists themselves. We may not be speaking about the same thing. His Holiness goes on to say, why then does Buddha call emotions such as attachment, anger, jealousy, arrogance, and fear afflictions? Why does he say they cause suffering and recommend counteracting them? The difficulty with these emotions, again, is that they are fueled by exaggeration and grasping, and thus do not perform their function in a reasonable way. There are a couple of formulas that have informed my own Buddhist practice, and you've seen them, but I'm going to write them up again.
Like a bucket in a well, migrators have no autonomy. First, with the thought I, they cling to a self. Then, with the thought mine, they become attached to things. I bow to this compassion that cares for migrators.
This is the story of our samsaric life. So His Holiness says, the difficulty with these emotions, again, is that they are fueled by exaggeration and grasping, and thus do not perform their function in a reasonable way. So, if we take a look at this, we know the root of cyclic existence, the root of suffering is self-grasping ignorance. And so that state of mind, that affliction, exaggerates the sense of self, right? The self does exist. Self just doesn't exist the way we think it does most of the time. So if we think about the body and mind are constantly changing. There's nothing about this body that's not constantly changing. The skin, the bones, the teeth, the hardest, probably even the fillings in the teeth. Everything about this body is constantly changing. If the hard parts are changing, it stands to reason the soft parts are changing as well. The mind too. If we sit and meditate for even a few minutes, we can see the mind's constantly changing. Therefore, the person is constantly changing. It's a dependent arising, depending on causes and conditions. So self-grasping ignorance is a distorted way of looking at or thinking about holding to the self. And as soon as that arises, that's the grasping I think he's referring to. As soon as that arises, then however we start perceiving things in our environment as either helpful or harmful. And if they're helpful, then immediately, well, there's a sense of pleasure, and there could be, if they're helpful, there's a sense of pleasure, and there's a good likelihood that there will be attachment for that. And before that, there's a distorted attention that I don't know exactly how this works. Maybe some of you have heard more teachings on this, but distorted attention exaggerates the good qualities of something so that attachment is ready to arise and then cling. The real purpose of attachment is the clinging, the not wanting to be separated from something. And distorted attention to the negative qualities of something or someone really exaggerate. That's where the exaggeration comes from. Exaggerates the negative qualities. And then anger is ready to harm or run away from that negative quality. So right there we can see there's the grasping, there's the exaggeration, and it leads to afflictions. And then when there are afflictions in the mind, although we're trying, as Venerable Simke was talking about, we have antidotes. We have, to the degree that those antidotes are developed, we may not go to a full-blown affliction, but chances are good if there's an affliction, there's going to be a karmic action. And the mouth starts moving, the mind starts moving, the body starts moving, so then there's karma action. And then that leaves karmic seeds that in the future, when the causes and conditions come together, whether that's craving and grasping or whether that's just conducive circumstances for things like experiencing results similar to the cause or environmental results, those results will arise. So I find this so helpful to have it succinctly drawn out like this, because really we could look at, by looking at this formula, we can think about the 12 links. A lot of the links are up here, aren't they? We could spell out the last number of links in results in terms of name and form and 6 sources, etc. But here's the first link. And then it doesn't include distorted attention or afflictions, but karma. That's the formative karma or formative action. And then I say karmic seeds here. That's how I've read it in the Lamrim, but we could also talk about that in terms of consciousness, the third link. I think also you could find the 4 Noble Truths included or implied in this formula. Also, we can find true cessations if we go backwards, if we reverse this continuum, and especially if we counter self-grasping ignorance with wisdom, then we cut the whole scenario, right? So he goes on to say, they may exaggerate the potential danger of the situation, the primacy of one's own interest, or the potential benefit to be gained. So I think there you could summarize that they exaggerate to the point that we're going to develop attachment, anger, and ignorance. When afflictions are manifest in our minds are clouded and we don't think clearly. We've heard that before, but in the moment it's so hard to see that, isn't it? I had an experience, and maybe you have experiences too that you could share about this. Years ago I was doing some work with a therapist and we recorded the sessions. And it was amazing how many times I would think that a session had gone a certain way and had come to some conclusion for myself. Like, oh, she thinks I'm a ditz, or or I've just blown it, or, some distorted way of thinking. And then I'd go back and I'd watch the video, and none of that was there. None of it. And this was so powerful for me that I started using it in my life. When I would find that there had been a difficult situation, I would stop and think, wow, if I had a video of this, I wonder what I'd see. So it was very helpful in those terms. So often we think just because we're experiencing something inside that it's true, that it's really happening that way. And yet we don't really stop to question, or we don't have the tools yet to stop and question if that's really the case. A lot of it is, as Venerable says, story making or creative writing. Do you have any... You're taking a... Oh, I see. He's taking a picture of... Not of me. Show me that video later. And I think this can be very useful, right? Like all of us have done a BBC, I think, except with a few exceptions. And do you find it helpful to go back and look? You might think, oh, I really blew that, or oh, that was silly to say that, and then you go back and you look at it and you think, no, it was fine.
Over the years, one of the things that I've realized is that, especially early on, when Venerable would be teaching and I would be having a strong reaction and, averse to it. And so I would go back and watch what she had said. And again, that same thing is like nothing from her side, all my deal. And so that helped me to start paying attention to the language and seeing which words I needed to translate so that they would go in, because I have some buttons around some certain language. And then that starts that whole sequence. So it was very helpful to really translate it a bit so that I got the essence of it instead of blocking.
Yeah. I've had that experience. Anybody else? Everyone? Yeah, thank you. Okay. So he says, instead of responding to a situation intelligently, we react impulsively, following an urge without sufficiently contemplating the likely effects of doing so. The results are often disastrous. In some conflicts, anger exposes us to far greater danger by making us act irrationally, which incites the other party to counter with more violent means. True, isn't it? And we can see that so blatantly in this day and age. Fear also can endanger our survival, for when we exaggerate danger, we may lash out when the threat is non-existent or minor. That's dangerous in a day and age when people are packing a gun. Or we hear lots of stories about overreactions from police officers. What else? Weapons of mass destruction. If this country thought that it was being attacked, fear among the leaders could certainly lead to an unfortunate reaction. Road rage. Yep. Or we may freeze when it would be wiser to act, or we may act heedlessly in our panic. It is especially tragic when a government or its citizens collectively fall into these distorted emotions. Some psychologists say that disturbing emotions are 90% exaggeration and projection. Again, I know that intellectually, don't you? But in the moment, sure seems like reality's happening. While there may be biological components, exaggeration and projection come from the mind and we are not generally aware when they step in. A sense of danger that is reasonable in one instance can be later exaggerated and projected onto many other situations, making a person unnecessarily anxious. Boy, that's pretty common today, it seems, doesn't it? I'm sure there are many contributing factors to that. Just the fact that we're bombarded with so much news and bad news or painful stories can contribute to that. So that's one thing. And then the anger that produces the rush of adrenaline that helps us to protect ourselves becomes a habit. And we create drama and conflict in our lives because the resulting adrenaline makes us feel alive. That's probably more common than we recognize, especially for people who grew up in high adrenaline states at home. You become addicted to it, really, and then continue creating drama so that you feel alive. So he says that we need to apply our human intelligence to our emotional lives, enabling us to discern which emotions lead to well-being and which lead to difficulties. Which emotions lead to well-being? In the Pali tradition, or in the Theravadan tradition, one of the ways that they meditate on loving kindness is to repeat the phrase, "May I be well, may I be happy." And it's such a powerful thing to think about. It's like putting the cause first. We say, "May I have happiness," and the causes of happiness, but they say, "May I be well, may I be happy." And I think you could probably interpret what wellness means in many different ways, but if we think about it, at least the way it's taught in our tradition, may I be well means may I have positive states of mind, may I have reasonable, concordant states of mind. And then I will be happy, right? I will have well-being and peace in my mind. So, each one of these words are packed. We could take each sentence from this line, from this section, and really think about it deeply, and apply it to our own life experience to learn more from it. So he says, here we see the psychological and sociological studies verify this, that children who grow up with kindness are generally more secure and emotionally balanced, while those who live in families with a lot of anger and physical or verbal violence are more anxious. If we think about this deeply and really imagine what is the proportion, what is the percentage of families just in our town, let's say Newport, where children are growing up surrounded by secure love and attachment, the secure attachment that they actually need to grow healthy psyches. And how many of those children are food insecure or shelter insecure? Some of you would know more about this being involved with yes. Or if we broaden that to our state, what would be the percentage? And for myself, if I think about this and how I've had to work to overcome some of these deficiencies, and I think about, I've got resources, I am privileged. I have resources to work with these things. And what about others? How do we take care of a society that has lost its ethical mooring in love and compassion and produces children as a result who will be challenged in certain areas because of that deficiency? How do we deal with that? And it's just growing exponentially, it seems. I don't know. We'd have to, how do you measure those things? I'm sure sociologists and public health people could help us with that. There's a world of difference between constructive and destructive emotions. In ordinary beings, afflictive emotions arise easily, and they are impulsive and reactive. Does that remind you about the bucket? Which number of the 6 analogies, which number is the fact that genuinely constructive emotions like compassion and generosity come through investigation and effort, while destructive emotions distort our view of a situation. Constructive emotions are conducive to accurate assessment. Yeah, which number analogy?
Bucket goes down easily.
Yeah, the bucket goes down so easily into afflictions or lower rebirths, and that's number 3. Yeah. Number 3 is about rebirth. What's number 4? Yeah, it's about how, I'm not clear. I'd have to look it up. Anybody have that on the tip of their computer? We should know this. These are things that we're meditating on, right? We just heard this twice.
Are you referring to when the bucket gets Are you referring to when the bucket gets hit by the walls of the well?
Nope, that's the last one. Just as a bucket effortlessly drops to the bottom of the well but is drawn up with great effort, it's number 4. So too, we easily drop to miserable rebirths and with great effort draw ourselves up to happy rebirths. Okay, so 3 and 4 are both about rebirth. But we could apply this also. Okay, I'm mistaken. I thought it was applying to afflictions, but maybe in some translations it is. I noticed there were some differences between how we found it in the introduction to the Middle Way and
I thought Venerable mentioned that it's very, you have to exert effort to do virtue, but non-virtue comes very easily. I thought she also taught that. So,
you think it's about number 2. I think number 2 is about self-grasping ignorance, because that's the operator. I mean, yes, an untamed mind, but specifically by ignorance that grasps at I. So, yeah, okay. Point taken. Yep. 1, 2, 4, and 6. Okay. And 3. All right. So, just for people who online who haven't been exposed to this, this was part of the Memorial Day retreat where we looked at this analogy from Chandakirti's text about the bucket and the well. Number 1, just as a bucket is bound by a rope to the windlass of a well, we are bound by afflictions and the actions they motivate. Number 2, just as a bucket is controlled by an operator, we too are controlled by our untamed minds, specifically by ignorance that grasps at the I as inherently existent and mine as inherently existent. Number 3, just as a bucket in a well goes up and down, we likewise go up and down repeatedly, taking rebirth in the 3 realms and the 6 classes of beings. These are my interpretations of them. Just as a bucket effortlessly, number 4, just as a bucket effortlessly drops to the bottom of the well but is drawn up with great effort, so we too easily drop to miserable rebirths and with great effort draw ourselves up to happy rebirths. And 5, just as a bucket doesn't determine its own movements, similarly the factors shaping our lives are the results of past ignorance, craving, and grasping, referring to the projecting causes of the 12 links. But as Venerable Sangye Kadro showed us, we could have all 12 links there in that understanding. And number 6, just as a bucket bangs against the walls, bangs against the wall of the well as it goes up and down, we too are battered day and night by the 3 kinds of suffering. Do you remember what number 7 is? The 7th is like the conclusion. Therefore, from the depths of our heart, we should strive to be free of this cyclic existence. His Holiness goes on to say, by examining the disadvantages and unrealistic perspectives of the afflictions, we will come to a point where we will make a determination to stop letting them run our lives. Anybody there yet? I noticed yesterday Venerable Kadro made a very strong statement about this, that when we have come to a conviction about, how did she say it? When we've come to a conviction about not wanting to harm, it was something like that, not wanting to harm, we stop harming. And I remember thinking, well, I've come to that conviction a number of times, but I have so much habituation that it doesn't stick. So I'm wondering how that plays out. And Venerable talked about this is one way that we actively recondition our perspective, right? By going over the disadvantages. So probably we all have lists somewhere in our notes or in our computer about the disadvantages of each of the 6 root afflictions or the 10 afflictions. And these are things that we really need to review again and again so that we actively recondition our perspective. And then also seeing the benefits of realistic and beneficial emotions, we will consciously cultivate them. So it's like the carrot and the stick, isn't it? We want to move away from the disadvantages. None of us want those disadvantages in our lives, and we want to move towards the benefits. In his teaching, the Buddha described the ways to think and meditate that make positive emotions arise. By familiarizing ourselves with these and with the antidotes to the afflictions again and again, our habitual emotions will change, and in situations where anger once mushroomed, compassion will radiate. So I appreciated what you said, Venerable Simke, and I bet all of us have our own story of that, or our own reflection of how we were a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, before we met the Dharma, and what we've observed in ourselves. And probably it's not a straight line, right? Probably it goes up and down depending on how much emphasis we're putting on the disadvantages of the afflictions or the benefits of the positive states of mind. So can you see why I can't leave any sentence of this chapter out? Like, this is so rich. And, yeah. So then he gives the example of mind training. For example, when harmed by another, we can think, while this person's action is harmful and I must act to stop it, he has the same wish to be happy as I do. Venerable Jigme used this in her BBC the other day when you were talking about the cowboy who asked you, just what are you? And Russell mentioned this too in his BBC. He was talking about how if we for a person who has difficulty connecting, this is my memory of what he said, for a person who has difficulty connecting, and we see that, they may resort to dominance as a way of, if they can't feel connected, then at least they'll be powerful or feel powerful. Did you take anything else away from what he was saying? In this way, we develop a sense of concern for the other person. So powerful. This will not only alleviate tension and anxiety in our own minds, but will also help us reach out to improve his situation. So I imagine by calling to mind, oh, this person's just like me and wants to have happiness, that would have alleviated some of your anxiety, Venerable Jigme, when in the story that you were telling. Is that the case? This in turn will result in the person responding to our kindness, like you exemplified there. Do others of you have stories where someone approached you with a bit of energy and you were able to show kindness and turn it around?
It's one of the, I think we all have some experiences where we're on the plane and we have someone sit next to us who's very, very strongly committed to their spiritual path and take one look at you in robes and know that you are a mission for them to change your mind. And so I had one of these experiences once, and it was about a 2.5-hour flight. And this kind man just simply was convinced that I was headed towards a deep, deep hell if I didn't see clearly what he was trying to share with me. So I ended up just really going back to my memory of how Jesus made an impact on me as a child. I mean, I kept trying to find similarities. You know, he kept really striking home his belief that without Christ in your, without Christ in your life, you are doomed, and that there's no redeeming qualities other than to be in that place, one with Christ. So I kept going back to just saying that, sharing a little bit about how I was before I met the Buddhist teachings, and how I am now, and that my qualities as a human being have certainly increased. And that I would think that any spiritual path that was worth its weight would be able to do that regardless of what faith it was. So I think after about 2 hours he finally was resigned by the fact that he was not going to convert me or save me. And I think as he got up, he stood up and he said, I'm a little sad that you didn't see it my way, but I'm glad that we took the time to talk. And so, but he was quite disappointed in his efforts, but he appreciated the fact that we were both willing to hold that space, because it got pretty impassioned from his side after a while.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
So this was not my kindness, but somebody else's kindness. And it happened quite a long time ago, but my family was moving to the States, and I was young, and I was on the plane, and next to me was a man who looked like he was Japanese. And I was very, very sad on that flight. And this man just took it upon himself to try to comfort me. Try to ask me questions and just tell me good things about the U.S. and where I was going, and sort of giving me something to look forward to. And he spent quite a bit of time and effort trying to, help me turn my mind into something other than sadness, and that was quite kind of him.
Mm-hmm. I remember an experience when I lived in Australia. There was one health food shop that we would go to occasionally, and they had really good gluten-free bread, Soul gluten-free sourdough, and I was just trying to connect with the person who was checking me out, and so I said something like, have you been up to Chenrezig Institute before? And she took great offense to that and said, no, I am a Christian. And I felt so bad that she felt like it was a threat or some kind of a confrontation. And so she said, no, I'm a Christian and I go to such and such a church and I believe this and that and the other thing. I don't remember the full conversation, but in that moment, I just immediately thought to affirm what she was doing. And I said, it's so wonderful that you are so engaged with your spirituality and your religious tradition. That's wonderful. And I could just see the relief in her face that she was being affirmed and not challenged. He says this type of kindness and compassion is developed only through reasoning and training. It does not arise instinctively. Interesting. So does that mean that our kindness and compassion is not instinctive, or what do you think that means?
To me, it means that we're habituated to being reactive with kleshas. And we need to do, it's like it takes a lot of effort for that bucket. So the effort is to get it so that we're habituated to have reactions that are of more of a loving nature, compassionate nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's taken a lot of reasoning and thinking about things to know that that's something we want to put our energy and effort into, isn't it? And make it a priority in our lives. And having things that work for your mind.
I think too, he's pointing out how this is kindness to someone who you perceive as harmful, right? That is really not. It really takes a lot of reasoning and practice, because the reflex is like, oh, they're harming me, I must get away, harm them back. That is somehow going to make the situation better. And the examples I think of are all related to when I was teaching, and it's a really slow, painful process, and you have to remind yourself, this is a child, they're not trying to harm you. Even if they do physically and verbally terrifying or endangering things, it's like your job is to help them. I was kind of professionally forced to love difficult people. But it was a really good experience.
Good training.
Yeah.
Yeah. He goes on to say, while bias, compassion, and kindness, the kind we might have for our child or parent, may have a biological basis, we must consciously purify them of attachment and greed. Instead of mindlessly following anger, we must assess if it is to our benefit. Okay, so while bias, compassion, and kindness, the kind we might have for our child or parent, may have a biological basis, we must consciously purify them of attachment. Yeah, that's a big one, isn't it? So it'll come up in the next section about how positive states of mind can be developed endlessly because they are not dependent on self-grasping ignorance, whereas the afflictions are, and so that makes them vulnerable, or what was the word? Not vulnerable, but weak, or something like that. Instead of mindlessly following anger, we must assess it if it's to our benefit. Okay, so then he goes on and gives us 4 nice examples of how we can remedy the situation with minimal harm to self and others. So there are 4 steps here on page 55. There's a progressive development in our reasons for not harming others. People who have not considered the benefits of kindness and the disadvantages of anger and greed may restrain themselves from killing, stealing, unwise sexual behavior, and lying in order to avoid punishment. While such restraint is beneficial, there is not a great deal of virtue in the intention behind it. However, it helps people get along better with others, and that's important. So that's really just focused on this one life alone, isn't it? And the self. What's in it for me? How can I avoid punishment? The second one, a step up from this, is thinking killing, stealing, and such are non-virtuous. If I do them, I will have to face the consequences after death, and these results could be dire. While this restraint is self-referenced, there is virtue in the person's motivation because she is considering the ethical dimension of her actions. So at least we're talking about the small scope, karma, reflecting on the law of cause and effect. The third step is thinking this sentient being wants to be happy. His or her life is as sacred as mine or as precious as mine. As a consequence, we avoid harming this person, or we think this person will suffer if she loses her possessions. Therefore, I will respect and protect her possessions. And in this way, we refrain from taking what is not given. None of us would steal, right? So, but we might take something that's not freely given. The outward action is the same as the two preceding cases, but our internal motivation is different. And it's very virtuous because it considers the effects of our actions on the other person. So where do we find that in the Lamrim? This person wants to be happy. Well, actually, we learned about that when we think about the mind. Yeah, it's really moving into that area, isn't it? And then finally, an even more advanced motivation is restraining ourselves from harming others because it not only causes them pain, but also interferes with our ability to attain full awakening and to be of the greatest benefit to sentient beings. So here we set the effect of having full-blown bodhicitta, the altruistic intention. I remember when I studied the Middle Way, that there were some very powerful statements. I think it was when we were studying the first ground of generosity, and how bodhisattvas restrain themselves because it's unbearable for them to think that they could delay their awakening by even a small amount if they were to engage in a non-virtuous action. It was quite moving to think about that that's their dominant or their predominant thought process. Okay, so that took a lot longer than I thought it would, but there's a lot there. As I said earlier, as I went through this section, I just kept thinking about the incredible kindness of His Holiness and Venerable Chödrön, and how His Holiness, what would you say, altered the way he presented the Dharma when he began teaching in the West in a way that would work for Western minds. How kind is that? And so this is what Venerable Chödrön has been collecting all these years and putting them into books so that countless beings can benefit from them. It's quite mind-blowing when you really think about that. So then the next section is working with afflictions, one of our main job descriptions, or one of our main activities. So Asanga's Treasury of Knowledge defines affliction as a phenomena that, when it arises, is disturbing in character, and that through arising disturbs the mind stream. That's pretty clear. And it is amazing to become more and more familiar with the quality of disturbance in the mind. Anger is obvious. That disturbs the mind. What about anxiety? Is that as clear? I guess it depends on the level of anxiety. What about attachment? Do we know that attachment disturbs the mind when it's active? If it's really strong, we do. Pride? That one's probably a little harder to find, I think. But when you see it, it's embarrassing.
It depends on how aware of our own minds we are.
Yeah, it depends on how aware of our own minds we are. That's right. And that's, I think, the point that he's making in this section, that we really need to engage a lot of mindfulness to see what's happening in our mind. Right? So let's go through it and see. While disturbing emotions may arise naturally in us ordinary beings, they can be eliminated. They are not an intrinsic part of the mind. They haven't penetrated its clear and cognizant nature. Afflictions are rooted in ignorance and other distorted conceptions, and as such they are fragile, that's the word, fragile, and can't stand up to the powerful states of mind that understand reality. So, again, this might be a little simple, but it's a visual that has been very helpful for me in my life. I think I've done it before, probably several times. Consciousness is like a large category, and one way of dividing it, there are many ways, but one way of dividing it is in terms, we were talking about this yesterday actually, main minds and mental factors. And so we can think about this in terms of primary eye or visual primary visual consciousness. We can go through all 5 of the senses. Primary auditory. Help me out here. Olfactory, thank you. Yeah, it's good to do them in order. This helps. And then gustatory and tactile consciousnesses. And as we were saying yesterday, these main minds are like a mirror. They just simply know the bare entity of an object. Or how was it that we said it yesterday? They know the general characteristics of the object. They don't have any preference for one over the other or any opinions. They just reflect. It's just clearly knowing. Clarity and awareness. Yeah. Wait a minute, it's coming. So this is how we know the external world. And then we know the internal world by the primary mental consciousness. And the point I was going to make here is that there's a coarse mental consciousness and a subtle one. Probably a medium one too, but we'll just say coarse and subtle for now. So when we were doing that exercise at the beginning, you know, at the time of death, these coarse consciousnesses dissolve into the next one, into the next one, into the next one, until finally what's left is a subtle primary mental consciousness that carries the karmic seeds to the next life, right? And then mental factors, we have 3 varieties. There's positive ones. So there's 11. And then afflicted ones. How many? 26, yeah. There's 6 primary and 20 secondary. And then there's neutral ones, right? So that's all the others. So what's powerful, I think, about thinking of the mind in this way is to notice what he's saying is that these afflicted states of mind or mental factors, mental events, are fragile. They're fragile because they don't accord with reality. These accord with reality, the positive ones. They accord with reality either conventionally or ultimately. The afflicted ones don't accord with reality, and therefore they can be countered by a positive one. The neutral ones go along with the other 2. And so, in this way, we can see how Buddhas, or, well, Bodhisattvas and Buddhas have increased these through their meditation to their utmost extent. These are not dependent on self-grasping ignorance, as he says later in that section. Where these afflicted ones are, these can be supported by afflictions in the beginning. Like right now, my mind has a lot of self-grasping ignorance, but I can still meditate on love and compassion and faith and those sorts of things. But eventually, the plan is that we get away from self-grasping ignorance, and there's wisdom now supporting my development of love, compassion, faith, generosity, etc. But the afflicted ones are always associated with self-grasping ignorance, like that scenario that I drew up before, right? And so they're always vulnerable to being undercut or being countered by a positive state of mind. So I like this image. It helps me.
Why do you need to use the term primary in front of it? Visual, auditory, olfactory, etc. consciousnesses?
Well, here we're dividing consciousness into primary minds and secondary minds.
Right.
So main minds, primary minds, or minds from a philosophical view, those are all talking about the main mind.
But isn't it so that whenever we talk about a visual consciousness, we're necessarily talking about a primary mind? So the term seems, I'm asking if the term seems necessary, because in your training you seem that you really use it consistently, but there's no such thing as a visual consciousness that isn't a main mind.
Feeling in the retinue of a visual consciousness is technically a visual consciousness, right?
I see.
But it's not a primary visual consciousness. But it's part of the retinue of a visual consciousness, so it can be included in visual. You'd say the feeling that accompanies a primary visual consciousness.
You wouldn't say feeling is a visual consciousness.
Well,
or would you?
I think you can. You can especially, I know you can say that when you talk about the primary mental consciousness. We used to do, what are the possibilities between a primary mental consciousness and mental factors, no, mental consciousness and, how did that go? Mental factors, something like that. Anyway, there's 4 possibilities. And the example given in the text was that feeling in the retinue of a mental consciousness is a mental consciousness, but not a primary mental consciousness. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've extrapolated that to, I don't know that I've seen that with visual consciousness, but definitely with mental consciousness. But when we look at mind and mental factors, main minds, primary minds, those 3 terms are synonymous. Whereas consciousness is synonymous with awareness and knowers. And mental factors, do you have other words for mental factors? Sometimes they're translated as mental events or states of mind. Okay, so he says that the stronger our wisdom grows, the weaker the afflictions become, and eventually they are completely eradicated. Looking forward to it. In contrast, constructive states of mind can be developed limitlessly. The fundamental nature of the mind is pure and stable. The innate subtle mind of clear light, which is the basis of the cultivation of positive states of mind, is stable in that it continues eternally without interruption. So that's that subtle mental consciousness, the innate subtle mind. There are many ways we can talk about that. While afflictions have powerful antidotes that can destroy them, no such countering force exists that can eliminate constructive emotions and attitudes. So this is another reason that we can use for talking about how mental consciousness doesn't cease at the end of this lifetime, but rather it goes on and on. There's nothing that would counter it. So these positive states of mind, they're based on an accurate perception and thus can be continually enhanced. Furthermore, the nature of the mind is such that once we become thoroughly habituated to these virtuous states, we don't need to make repeated effort to cultivate them. They will continue on limitlessly. Often the example of a long jumper is used. You heard that one? High jumper. Oh, I heard it as a long jumper. Either way. Yeah. Yeah, either one works. That, physically, to long jump well, you would have to train and train and train and train, and then you can get really proficient at it. But if you stop training, you'll lose that capacity. Where the mind is such that if you train in positive states of mind, you can actually develop them to the point that they are, what would you say? Self-perpetuating, yes. And, they're developed to their consummate degree, which is what Buddhists have done.
What I heard with the high jump thing is that every time you do a jump, to get further, you still have to make that you have to start from the ground and make that whole effort of all of what you've already accomplished in the past and go higher than that. Where, as you develop your mind, you're moving forward, but it's not like you have to jump through all the preliminary stages, yeah.
Okay. I guess, that you can think of it that way. I would think that someone who's trained in high jumping or long jumping for many, many years would have a facility with that. That it's not like they're starting from day one where they haven't trained at all, right? So there is some facility.
Right. But if you're jumping, 19 feet, and tomorrow you want to jump 19 feet, 4 inches, you have to do the whole 19 feet and more. Yeah.
With every jump.
With every jump. But you've trained to learn how to do that, but still.
Okay.
And it's limited what you can do. Yeah.
Yes, that's the main point, isn't it? And the real takeaway is that the mind is different. That the mind can be developed limitlessly in positive or concordant, accurate ways of thinking. To the point that we don't lose it, which is so encouraging. It's very empowering to think of that, isn't it? And we can probably see that to some degree in our own practice. The more we're focusing on a particular state of mind, that we get some traction with it, and it's there more readily. unfortunately, if you turn your mind to something else, you may lose some of that again and build it back up, but it will be easier the next time. Or maybe you've memorized something. This has certainly happened to me. You've memorized something and then you lose it, but it is easier to memorize it the second time. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to jump down a little bit. He says, however, learning how destructive emotions arise and observing this process with mindfulness enables us to see that they are not givens. We can learn to detect harmful emotions while they are still small and swiftly apply their antidotes. So do you remember how afflictions arise? That's one way. Self-grasping ignorance, inappropriate attention, afflictions. Yep. Can you think of any other place where we've studied that? Yeah. Yeah, 6 causes. Do you remember them? Let's see if we... Okay, good. Which ones can you remember? Let's see if we can remember them all.
Contact with an object.
Yeah, object.
Habit.
Habit.
Bad friends.
Bad friends.
Contact, habit, bad friends. Distorted attention, I think, is one of them.
Distorted attention,
The media.
Verbal stimuli, yeah. Like
And then
media.
one more. That was 5.
Having the seeds themselves.
Oh, the
The
seeds
seeds.
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Okay. So he says we can learn to detect harmful emotions while they are still small and swiftly apply their antidotes. So again, as you were saying, Venerable Losang, this is a facility of having mindfulness and some introspection, isn't it? And this is something that we can develop further and further to greater and greater degrees, right? So that we can catch ourselves when we're going through the lunch line, instead of thinking, I have to have more of that chocolate cake, you can say, wait a minute, what's the real cause of happiness? It's not the chocolate cake, is it? So, that's one way I use it. How else can you think of other ways that you catch yourself these days? I'm sure you've had many ways of becoming aware of disturbing emotions. Actually, he goes on to say, we can use the awareness of our body and physical sensations. That's helpful in becoming aware of disturbing emotions as they begin to arise, changing in our breathing, in our heart rate, body temperature, muscle tension. How do you know when afflictions are arising? I guess it depends on the affliction, but what do you notice?
I just had one recently and that was quite vivid. I was in the middle of confession with Venerable Children and she called me on something. And my first reaction was to defend myself. And just as I was starting to defend myself, she interrupted me and added something to it. But during the time that she interrupted me and elaborated, I had a chance to hold myself. And then by the time she was finished elaborating, I was able to just say, yes, thank you, Venerable. So I noticed it. I noticed the big surge of energy. Mm-hmm. It wasn't anger. It was just more of the immediate reaction of wanting to counter with an argument of my own.
Yeah.
And so I felt that surge of energy, but the fact that she gave me an additional time to look at what was going on in my mind and correct it, that helped a lot. And I realized that what happened in my mind, what triggered it was that I went into, this is unfair, and I need to explain why it's unfair.
How about others? How do you notice when afflictions are arising? Depends on the affliction, of course. But
Mostly for me, it's energy change in my body, and it seems to come from below and start working up the body. And if I can catch it at the abdomen, I can turn it. But if it gets up higher than that, then I am it. So.
What has helped me a lot is how Venerable, I don't know how else to put it, ventriloquizes the afflictions. That's helped me a lot because when it's up and it's talking in that, you're like, my thoughts are correct, period. Of course it's true. And then she ventriloquizes all of them. So anytime I'm thinking, but I'm right and they're wrong, it's like, oh, you're angry. Okay, we can stop now. Yeah, that's just been a huge help.
Mostly, I think it's just the experience of pain in the mind. Actually, I mean, it's just everyone is so painful. They have different kinds of pain, but it's so unpleasant, And if I'm not afflicted, my mind is peaceful, and so I think the energy thing is part of it. But also, if my thoughts are fast, or actually, I can watch my behaviors a lot of times. If I can't, if I think I'm going to defend myself, I pretty much have learned to keep my mouth closed. That will never work. Yeah, I guess it's watching what I'm starting to do. It's gone into behavior sometimes, how I'm talking, or body, speech, and mind.
Yeah. Except for the big surges of anger, which are very bodily and unfortunate. What I think the biggest clue for all of them is to watch the inner monologue or the inner commentary. If I can see that I am making somebody wrong, or wanting to blame, or even way before it comes out of my mouth, I can hear what I'm saying to myself. Oh, you're off the deep end.
Yeah. We are very fortunate that we have seen many dramatizations from Venerable Children about these different afflictions, and those things do arise in the mind and are very helpful antidotes. Yeah.
While I have the microphone too, I will say that as an antidote, one of the things that she has often said is to catch yourself and say, when you feel it at all, I am not seeing reality correctly. Works really well for me as a stopgap. I may not know what's going on, but when I can say, you are not seeing reality correctly, and it helps.
If you're suffering, you're deluded. Yeah. I guess my version of that is this will not lead to the outcome you want. Yeah.
I was sitting in the garden earlier today, and I just was saying, this is the best moment of my life. This is the most beautiful place in the world. And I had all this energy running through me. I felt like I wanted to dance or something. And somehow the thought came up, oh, you're probably attached to this moment. But I think attachment is tricky because there seems to be something virtuous going on. Oh, I'm just enjoying the moment. This is good. I'm not experiencing pain. Like Venerable Tarpa said, there's no pain in my mind, not for a million miles, at least right now. But then almost automatically there's attachment, and I've tried to tease that out, and it's this. I think Venerable Jigme has said this fizziness or this zinginess. There's all this extra energy. I think that's really a good clue. Is the surge with any affliction. I think there's going to be some kind of heightened energy because the mind is not calm. It's not peaceful.
Right. It's excited.
At the same time, I'm not sure what a calm or peaceful mind really feels like, because I feel like there's always some kind of low-grade affliction running, mostly anxiety. So it's hard for me to have except when I'm in meditation, to have a counterpoint for comparison. But then when I'm in meditation and I experience these positive states, I also get probably really attached to those.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, what exactly I'm looking for, but I think the energy surges are a big clue.
I just came back I was away for 2 weeks, and I walked into the Generosity Hall, the storage room, and there was stuff put on the shelves and all of that, and at my point of view, it was messy and all of this. And I felt that energy again moving through my body. And I saw it, and what it was nice is that fight, I'm a fighter. I didn't want that. I said, well, And it's all about having it my way, right? And I said to myself, if you want it clean, clean it. If not, just leave it like that. Like it was like, and do it with an happy mind. There was no, just.
You still have vacation mind influencing. And that's good. Keep it up.
Yeah, it has.
Yeah.
It's present right now. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, the fighting. It's like Venerable Tarpa said. It's
exhausting.
painful.
Yeah, it's exhausting, isn't it?
And it's all about my way,
Yeah.
having it my way.
The afflictions wear you out. They just wear you out. And also, certain ones, they don't allow you to sleep. You know, I mean,
I know
there's
those.
so many things that go on with them. Yeah, just, all kinds of negative, things that make you suffer happen.
Uh-huh. Okay.
But I do appreciate organization. Not saying that chaos is. I don't feel good in a chaotic place, and it's. I think. But it's not. I'm not attached to it as I used to be, because that is painful. It's just, well, if you want it more organized, well, just organize it. That's it.
Great. Okay. Thank you for your participation tonight. We got down to about the bottom of page 56 for the next person. So thank you for putting up with me reading line by line. But like I said, I just found this to be like this is our work right here, and such beautiful words. So let's just dedicate.